The living room fell silent the moment Zainab entered, carrying a tray of tea with hands that never trembled, even when her heart did. Karim's colleagues sat scattered across the leather sofas, their laughter still echoing from whatever joke had been shared seconds before. She moved through the space like a gentle breeze, setting cups down with careful precision, offering polite smiles that never quite reached her eyes anymore. As she turned to leave, Karim's voice stopped her mid-step. "See what I mean," he said, gesturing toward her retreating figure. "Too quiet. My wife grew up in some village where women don't speak unless spoken to. It's like talking to a shadow sometimes." The men chuckled, not cruelly, but thoughtlessly, the way people laugh at observations that don't concern them personally. Zainab's fingers tightened around the empty tray. She didn't turn around. She simply continued walking, her footsteps soft against the marble floor, swallowing the familiar sting that had become her daily companion. This was the 5th time this month Karim had reduced her existence to a punchline, and it was only the 12th. In the kitchen, she stood gripping the counter's edge, breathing slowly through her nose. Merit, her mother had told her, required patience. Patience meant absorbing words that cut, enduring corrections disguised as care, maintaining peace even when peace felt like slow erasure. Zainab had become an expert at this particular kind of patience. Stino. Longhill shared her thoughts at dinner. She no longer laughed freely. She had learned that her husband preferred her presence to be decorative rather than participatory, a well-kept home, a properly dressed wife, a woman who enhanced his image without challenging his narrative. What Karim genuinely believed was that respect was a volume game. Loud people commanded attention. Bold people seized opportunities. Confident people, the kind who walked into rooms and announced themselves, those were the individuals worth admiring. His wife, with her countryside upbringing and soft-spoken nature, simply didn't register on his scale of importance. He had convinced himself that her quietness was emptiness, that her gentleness was simplicity, that her unwillingness to argue meant she had nothing substantial to contribute. He often compared her unfavorably to the women in his professional circle. Women like Nadia. Nadia worked in Karim's office building, managing client relations for a competing firm. She was everything Zainab was not, sharp-tongued, expensively dressed, city-bred with the kind of polish that came from private schools and international travel. Here laughter filled conference rooms. Here opinions dominated meetings. She wore confidence like expensive perfume, and Karim found himself increasingly drawn to its scent. Their friendship had started innocently enough. Coffee in the building's cafe. Conversations about industry trends. Compliments that felt professional until they didn't. Nadia had a gift for making Karim feel seen in ways he claimed his wife never managed. She praised his insights. She laughed at his jokes with genuine enthusiasm. She made him feel like the intelligent, accomplished man he wanted to believe he was. What made the situation particularly cruel was that Nadia had also become Zainab's confidant. It started when Karim suggested Zainab needed more sophisticated friends and arranged for Nadia to take her shopping, to teach her about modern style, to help her integrate into the social circles that mattered. Zainab, desperate for connection in her increasingly lonely marriage, had welcomed the friendship gratefully. During their shopping trips and coffee meetings, she began opening up about her struggles, the constant criticism, the feeling of never being enough, the loneliness of loving someone who seemed perpetually disappointed. Nadia listened with perfect sympathy. She held Zainab's hands across cafe tables and said things like, "You deserve so much better, and some men don't recognize treasure when it's right in front of them." She encouraged Zainab to be patient, to keep trying, to believe that Karim would eventually see her worth. What Zainab didn't know was that those same evenings, after comforting her about her marriage, Nadia would text Karim. Their messages had progressed from professional to personal to intimate with alarming speed. Late-night conversations about everything Karim felt was missing from his life. Compliments that crossed professional boundaries. Eventually, meetings that had nothing to do with work. Karim justified it effortlessly. He wasn't technically doing anything wrong, he told himself. Used talking to someone who understood him. Used spending time with someone who appreciated him. His marriage had become a formality, a quiet woman who made his house comfortable but didn't make his heart race. Where was the harm in seeking intellectual and emotional stimulation elsewhere? The harm, of course, was everywhere. It was in the way he stopped asking Zainab about her day. In the way he flinched when she touched his shoulder. In the way he scheduled more and more evening work commitments that always seemed to involve Nadia. In the way he had slowly, methodically, built a parallel life that excluded his wife entirely while still expecting her to maintain the appearance of his perfect home. At family gatherings, the pattern continued. Karim's mother would ask Zainab to help in the kitchen while the men discussed business and politics in the living room. His sisters would exchange knowing glances when Zainab spoke, their expressions suggesting they agreed with Karim's assessment: too simple, too quiet, not quite right for their ambitious brother. Nobody asked Zainab what she thought about the economy or current events. Nobody seemed to consider that her quietness might stem from being consistently shut down rather than having nothing to say. One evening, after a particularly brutal family dinner where Karim had jokingly suggested Zainab take a public speaking course to learn how to contribute to conversations, she sat alone in their bedroom and stared at her reflection. When had she become this translucent? When had her own presence become something she apologized for? She remembered being different once, younger, in her village, where her thoughtfulness had been valued, where her observations had been welcomed, where quiet didn't mean worthless. That same night, Karim was texting Nadia, complaining about the evening. "I don't know why I thought she'd improve," he wrote. "Some people are just limited, I guess." Nadia's response was perfectly calibrated: "You deserve someone on your level. Someone who challenges you intellectually." The tragedy was that Karim genuinely couldn't see what he had. He looked at Zainab and saw only what she wasn't: not loud, not bold, not impressive to his colleagues. He never noticed her intelligence, the way she managed their entire household with quiet efficiency. He never appreciated her emotional wisdom, the way she could read people and situations with remarkable accuracy. He never valued her strength, the kind that endured daily dismissal without becoming bitter. Yusuf had noticed, though. Yusuf was Karim's former colleague, someone Karim had always dismissed as too ordinary and lacking ambition. Yusuf didn't chase promotions aggressively. He didn't network obsessively. He lived simply, spoke thoughtfully, and treated everyone with the same quiet respect. Karim found him boring. But Yusuf had always seen Zainab clearly. He noticed the grace in her movements, the intelligence in her observations during the rare moments she was allowed to speak, the strength it took to endure Karim's constant belittling without losing her gentleness. Their paths crossed occasionally at social events, and Yusuf always made it a point to actually listen when Zainab spoke, to ask follow-up questions, to treat her contributions as valuable. These small moments of being genuinely seen had meant more to Zainab than Yusuf probably realized. Meanwhile, Karim's double life continued. Nadia's presence in his world expanded while Zainab's contracted. The betrayal was building, brick by brick, in plain sight. And Zainab, who had learned to make herself small to avoid criticism, had no idea that the woman comforting her about her failing marriage was the same woman slowly replacing her in it. The storm was coming. And when it broke, it would shatter everything Karim thought he understood about value, about worth, about what actually mattered. The afternoon Zainab's world collapsed started ordinarily enough. She had left the house early for a doctor's appointment, something routine she'd mentioned to Karim the night before, though he hadn't been listening. The appointment finished earlier than expected, and she found herself heading home at 2 in the afternoon instead of 4. She carried a small bag of groceries she'd picked up on the way, thinking she might prepare Karim's favorite meal as a peace offering for whatever unnamed offense had made him so distant lately. Kirki turned silently in the lock. She pushed the door open, and that's when she heard it: laughter. Not just any laughter, but the kind that held intimacy, the kind that suggested comfort and familiarity and things that should only exist between husband and wife. Zainab froze in the doorway, groceries suddenly heavy in her hands. The laughter was coming from the living room, and it belonged to two people, Karim and Nadia. She moved forward on instinct, her footsteps silent as always, until she could see into the living room. They weren't touching, not exactly, but they were standing close enough that the space between them felt like a confession. Nadia's hand rested on Karim's arm, her head tilted back in laughter at something he'd just said. Karim's expression was one Zainab hadn't seen in years: genuine happiness, unguarded and warm. The grocery bag slipped from Zainab's fingers. The sound of oranges hitting the marble floor echoed like gunshots. Both heads turned. Kareem's face cycled through expressions rapidly: surprise, guilt, irritation, and finally, cold indifference. Nadia stepped back smoothly, her face arranging itself into concern that now looked like the performance it had always been. "Zainab," she said, her voice dripping with false warmth. "You're home early." Zainab couldn't speak. Her throat had closed around words that wouldn't come. She looked at her husband, searching his face for some explanation that would make this scene innocent, some context that would restore her world to its axis. But Kareem's eyes held nothing: no apology, no shame, no love. Just annoyance at being interrupted. "We need to talk," he said flatly, as if they were discussing a broken appliance rather than a broken marriage. Nadia gathered her purse with practiced efficiency. "I should go," she murmured, squeezing Kareem's hand in a gesture so casual it suggested countless other times she'd done the same. As she passed Zainab, she had the audacity to touch her shoulder sympathetically. "I'm sorry you had to find out this way," she whispered, and Zainab felt the world tilt violently. Find out. As if there was something to find out. As if this had been happening for longer than just this afternoon. When the door closed behind Nadia, silence filled the space like poison gas. Zainab finally found her voice. "How long?" she asked, and was surprised by how steady she sounded. Kareem sighed, running his hand through his hair with the exhaustion of someone forced to deal with an unpleasant task. "Does it matter?" "Zainab, let's be honest. This marriage hasn't been working for a long time." "You brought her into our home," Zainab said, each word carefully placed. "You made me trust her. You told her things, private things about us, about how lonely I felt, and all that time she was." "She understands me," Kareem interrupted, his voice rising with defensive irritation. "She actually talks to me like an equal. She has opinions, ambitions, intelligence. We're on the same level, Zainab. Joe and I never were." The cruelty of it stole her breath. She had endured years of small cuts, the jokes at her expense, the constant corrections, the dismissive comments. But this was different. This was Kareem explicitly stating that she was beneath him. That her love and loyalty and years of trying to be enough had never mattered because she simply wasn't worthy of mattering. "I want you to leave," he said, and his tone was businesslike. "Pinel. I'll give you money to get settled somewhere. You can go back to your village, find someone more suited to you. This isn't personal, Zainab. We're just incompatible. Not personal." As if dismantling someone's entire life could somehow be impersonal. Zainab didn't cry. She didn't scream or beg or fall apart the way part of her wanted to. Instead, she nodded slowly, mechanically, the way she'd learned to nod at all his criticisms over the years. "When?" she asked quietly. "Tonight would be best," Kareem said, already pulling out his phone, already moving on to whatever came next in his meticulously planned life. "Pack your things." Ella arranged transportation. She climbed the stairs to their bedroom, her former bedroom, feeling like a ghost haunting her own life. Her hands moved automatically, pulling clothes from closets, folding them into the same battered suitcase she'd brought when she first arrived as a hopeful bride. She packed her few pieces of jewelry, her books, the photographs of her parents. Everything that mattered fit into 2 bags, and somehow that felt like the saddest detail of all. Kareem didn't come upstairs. He didn't offer to help or say goodbye or acknowledge the ending of their marriage beyond its logistical requirements. When Zainab finally descended with her bags, he was on the phone, laughing at something someone had said. It covered the receiver briefly. "The car's outside," he said, then returned to his conversation. The driver, a young man who clearly sensed the tension, loaded her bags silently. Zainab took one last look at the house she'd tried so hard to turn into a home, then climbed into the back seat. "Where to, madam?" the driver asked gently. She opened her mouth and realized she had no answer. She had no family in the city. The few friends she'd made were really Kareem's friends, people who would inevitably side with him in whatever narrative he spun about their separation. She had nowhere to go. "Just drive," she whispered, and tears finally came, silent and steady. They drove for 20 minutes before Zainab noticed where they were, passing through a neighborhood she vaguely recognized. And then she saw him, Yusuf, walking home from the market with his own bag of groceries, moving with that unhurried calm that Kareem had always mocked his laziness. Stop, Zainab said suddenly. Please stop the car. The driver pulled over, concerned. Zainab stepped out onto the sidewalk, her legs unsteady, her vision still blurred with tears. Yusuf looked up and saw her, and his expression shifted immediately from surprise to concern. It closed the distance between them quickly. Zainab, he said, taking in her tear-stained face, the car idling behind her, the visible devastation in her eyes. What happened? She tried to speak, but the words tangled in her throat. Instead, she just shook her head, and something in that gesture told him everything he needed to know. He glanced at the car, at her bags visible through the window, and understanding dawned. Come inside, Yusuf said simply, not asking questions she wasn't ready to answer. You shouldn't be alone right now. I can't impose, Zainab started, but Yusuf was already signaling to the driver, already reaching for her bags. You're not imposing, he said firmly. You're accepting help from a friend. There is a difference. His apartment was modest but immaculately kept, filled with books and plants and the kind of comfortable simplicity that Karim would have scorned as lacking ambition. Yusuf set her bags down gently, gestured to the sofa, and disappeared. Into the kitchen. He returned moments later with tea and tissues, setting both within her reach before settling into the chair across from her, giving her space but staying present. You don't have to tell me anything, Yusuf said quietly. But if you want to talk, I'm listening. And somehow, that simple offer, the genuine choice to speak or not speak, to be heard without judgment, broke something open in Zainab. The story poured out, years of dismissal, Nadia's betrayal, Karim's cold dismissal, the feeling of being erased piece by piece until she'd almost disappeared entirely. Yusuf listened without interrupting, his expression growing darker not with anger but with deep sadness. When she finally fell silent, exhausted from the telling, he spoke carefully. Karim is a fool, Yusuf said, and there was no satisfaction in his voice, just quiet conviction. But his foolishness isn't your fault, and it definitely doesn't define your worth. He said we were never on the same level, Zainab whispered. He was right about that, Yusuf said, and when Zainab's eyes flew to his face, she saw no mockery there. You were always above him. It just couldn't see high enough to notice. The first morning in Yusuf's apartment, Zainab woke to sunlight streaming through unfamiliar windows and the smell of fresh coffee. For a moment, disoriented, she forgot where she was. Then memory crashed back, Karim's dismissal, Nadia's betrayal, the collapse of everything she'd known. She expected the pain to be overwhelming, but instead what she felt was strange and unexpected, relief. Yusuf knocked softly on the guest room door. I'm heading to work, he called. There's breakfast on the table. Take whatever you need from the kitchen. This is your space now, for as long as you need it. No conditions. No expectations. No corrections about how she should feel or what she should do next. Used simply, uncomplicated kindness. The days that followed established a rhythm entirely different from what Zainab had known. Yusuf left for work each morning, giving her solitude to process and heal. He returned in the evenings with groceries, never presuming to know what she wanted but always asking. Their conversations over dinner were revelatory, not because they discussed anything extraordinary, but because Yusuf actually listened when she spoke. What do you think about the new transit proposal? He asked one evening, referencing something he'd heard on the news. Zainab hesitated, old habits of silence rising automatically. But Yusuf waited, genuinely interested, and slowly she offered her perspective. When she finished, he didn't dismiss or correct her. Instead, he said, I hadn't considered that angle. That's actually brilliant. Something tight in Zainab's chest loosened slightly. As weeks passed, she began rediscovering parts of herself she'd forgotten existed. Yusuf's bookshelves became her refuge. She read voraciously, novels and poetry and philosophy she'd abandoned years ago when Karim suggested her reading habits were impractical. Yusuf would find her curled on the sofa with a book and smile, asking what she thought of it, engaging with her ideas as if they mattered because they did. You're not quiet because you're empty, Yusuf said one evening after a particularly deep conversation about a novel they'd both read. You're quiet because you observe deeply. You process before speaking. That's not weakness, Zainab. That's wisdom. She felt tears prick her eyes, but this time they weren't tears of pain. They were tears of recognition, someone finally seeing her accurately. Yusuf never rushed her healing. He never pushed for explanations about her marriage or demanded decisions about her future. He simply created space for her to breathe, to think, to gradually unfold back into herself. When she started cooking tentatively at first, then with increasing confidence, he praised her skill without the backhand criticisms Karim had always attached. When she spoke about potentially finding work, he encouraged her without imposing direction. "What do you want to do?" he asked simply. The question stunned her. What did she want? She'd spent so many years trying to be what Karim wanted that her own desires had become foreign territory. "I used to love teaching," she said slowly, remembering. "Children. Primary school age. Back in my village, before I married, I helped at the local school." "Then you should teach," Yusuf said, as if it were obvious. "You'd be extraordinary at it." Within weeks, Zainab had enrolled in a certification program. Yusuf helped her navigate the applications, celebrated when she was accepted, never once suggesting she was incapable or needed excessive guidance. She began attending classes, engaging with other students, slowly building a life that was hers rather than an appendage to someone else's. And somewhere in those quiet months, something shifted between them. It wasn't dramatic or sudden. It was in the way Yusuf's hand would brush hers when passing dinner plates. In the way Zainab found herself laughing, genuinely. Laughing at his gentle humor. In the way they'd stay up talking long past reasonable bedtimes, sharing dreams and fears and the kind of vulnerability that only exists between people who truly trust each other. "I'm falling in love with you," Yusuf said one evening, the words simple and honest. "I don't expect anything. I just wanted you to know." Zainab looked at this man who had seen her at her lowest and treated her with unwavering dignity. This man who celebrated her quietness instead of criticizing it, who encouraged her dreams instead of diminishing them, who made her feel cherished rather than tolerated. "I'm falling in love with you too," she said, and felt her heart expand with a kind of joy she hadn't known was possible. Meanwhile, across the city, Karim's carefully constructed new life was disintegrating spectacularly. Nadia had moved into his house within weeks of Zainab's departure. Initially, Karim had been thrilled, finally, a partner who matched his energy, who understood his ambitions, who made him feel appreciated. But the qualities that had attracted him in secret became irritating in daily proximity. Nadia's boldness, so appealing in controlled doses, became exhausting. She had opinions about everything: how he dressed, what he ate, who he socialized with, how he managed his career. The compliments that had once felt validating now felt manipulative, always tied to suggestions for how he could improve or change. "Why are you wearing that tie?" she'd ask, wrinkling her nose. "It makes you look dated. You really should be more aggressive in meetings. You wouldn't let people dismiss my ideas like that. Are we really eating at this restaurant? I thought you had better taste." Every day brought new criticisms disguised as helpful observations. Karim found himself exhausted, defending choices he'd never had to justify before. He remembered, with uncomfortable clarity, how peaceful his home used to be. How Zainab never nagged or criticized or demanded he be anyone other than who he was. Nadia's spending became another issue. She had expensive tastes and no hesitation about indulging them with his money. Designer clothes, luxury spa treatments, elaborate dinners at trendy restaurants, the bills mounted alarmingly. When Karim gently suggested they budget more carefully, Nadia's response was icy. "I thought you wanted a sophisticated woman," she said coldly. "Sophistication costs money. If you can't afford me, perhaps you should have stayed with your village wife." The jab stung more than Karim wanted to admit. At work, colleagues who had initially been amused by the affair began treating him differently. Whispers followed him through hallways. His reputation, once solid, now carried the taint of a man who'd discarded his wife for his mistress. A major client explicitly requested a different account manager, citing personal values alignment. Karim's career trajectory, which had seemed so promising, stalled uncomfortably. Even his family, who had never particularly valued Zainab, expressed disappointment. His mother called one evening, her voice heavy with reproach. "That girl served you faithfully for years, and you threw her away for what? For someone who's already spending your money faster than you earn it." 6 months after Zainab's departure, Kareem sat in his expensively furnished but joyless home, listening to Nadia complain about some perceived slight from a friend, and realized he'd made a catastrophic mistake. The woman he thought was beneath him had actually been the foundation holding his life together. Her quietness hadn't been weakness, it had been peace. Her simplicity hadn't been limitation, it had been contentment. Her patience hadn't been stupidity, it had been grace. He thought about reaching out, apologizing, asking if they could try again. But pride held him back. Surely Zainab was struggling wherever she'd landed. Surely she'd take him back if he offered. He'd wait a bit longer, let her struggle enough to appreciate his return. The encounter that shattered the delusion happened on a Saturday evening at Bella Notte, an upscale Italian restaurant downtown. Kareem had reluctantly agreed to take Nadia there despite the exorbitant prices. They were being seated when he saw her. Zainab. But not the Zainab he remembered. This woman wore a flowing emerald dress that highlighted her natural elegance. Her hair, which she'd always worn simply, was styled beautifully. But more than her appearance, it was her energy that stunned him. She radiated confidence and genuine happiness. And beside her sat Yusuf. Kareem's chest tightened painfully. Yusuf, the man he'd mocked as ordinary and unambitious, sat attentively across from Zainab, listening to something she was saying with complete focus. As Kareem watched, Zainab laughed, the sound carrying across the restaurant, pure and unrestrained. Yusuf's face lit up in response, and he reached across the table to gently squeeze her hand. The gesture was so tender, so naturally affectionate, that it physically hurt Kareem to witness. Nadia followed his gaze, her expression hardening. "Isn't that your ex-wife?" she said loudly enough that nearby tables turned. Zainab heard. Her eyes met Kareem's across the restaurant, and in that moment, he saw everything he'd lost. She didn't look angry or hurt. She looked free. Unburdened. Happy in a way she'd never been with him. She smiled, not mockingly, not triumphantly, just a small, polite acknowledgement, then turned back to Yusuf, dismissing Kareem as easily as he'd once dismissed her. The message was clear, she had moved on. More than that, she had moved up. Kareem barely tasted his expensive meal. He watched peripherally as Yusuf and Zainab shared their dinner, their conversation flowing naturally, their comfort with each other obvious and authentic. This was what partnership looked like: mutual respect, genuine interest, unconditional support. Everything he'd hadn't thrown away. When Yusuf and Zainab rose to leave, they passed close to Kareem's table. Yusuf nodded politely. Zainab paused briefly, and for a moment Kareem thought she might speak to him. Instead, she simply said, "I hope you find what you're looking for, Kareem." He finally did. Then they were gone, leaving Kareem sitting across from Nadia's irritated expression, drowning in regret and the devastating understanding that some mistakes cannot be unmade. Love, Zainab learned, is not allowed to be real. It doesn't demand you diminish yourself to fit someone else's expectations. Real love sees your quietness as depth, your gentleness as strength, your patience as grace. It asks, "What do you need?" instead of insisting, "This is what you lack." Kareem learned, too late, that worth isn't measured in volume or boldness, and that the ordinary, faithful love he'd dismissed as insufficient was actually the rarest treasure he'd ever possess. So many people enter our lives as blessings, others arrive as lessons. The wise learn to recognize which is which before it's too late. Respect, once broken through carelessness and cruelty, cannot be begged back into existence. But new love, patient, kind, and genuine, can heal wounds we thought permanent and teach us that we were never too quiet, too simple, or too small. We were simply with the wrong person. Jube got this, every heart learning what it truly deserves.